Why did some of the greatest minds in history prefer solitude? Was it a trait of genius or simply a symptom of alienation? Arthur Schopenhauer, one of the most pessimistic and visionary philosophers of the 19th century, had an answer. And it was anything but kind to society. To him, the world was full of superficial people, trapped in trivial conversations and meaningless distractions. Genius, by its very nature, demanded distance from this mediocre spectacle. Solitude is the fate of all exceptional spirits, he said. But was he right? Or were great thinkers simply incapable of connecting with others? Think about it. Nikola Tesla, Emily Dickinson, Isaac Newton. All geniuses, all isolated. Is this a privilege reserved for the intellectually superior, or just a curse disguised as a virtue? Imagine a genius completely immersed in his thoughts. While the world moves on and people talk about the weather or the latest trends, he reflects on the fate of humanity, on the mysteries of the universe. His mind operates on another level, and the deeper he dives into his inner world, the harder it becomes to find someone to share it with. Schopenhauer was certain. Superior intelligence creates a natural barrier. It's not that these individuals hate society. It's that they simply don't fit in. While most people are distracted by the immediate, they seek the eternal. While many are content with the surface, they plunge into the depths. And that contrast isolates them. Tesla avoided human contact because he saw it as a distraction. Nietzsche said that the crowd is a sea in which free spirits drown. And if you look at history, you'll see this pattern again and again. The brightest minds tend to walk alone. But here's the problem. Solitude can be a refuge, but it can also be a prison. Because while distancing yourself from mediocrity allows for clarity of thought, it can also make you a stranger in your own world. Many of these geniuses weren't just solitary, they were also tormented. Depression, anxiety, the feeling of not belonging. All of it was part of both their greatness and their burden. So the big question arises. Is this isolation a curse or a blessing? For Schopenhauer, the answer was clear. Great thinkers shouldn't just accept their solitude, they should embrace it as a gift. Only in silence and far from social mediocrity could they achieve their greatest accomplishments. He didn't see social life as a space for genuine exchange, but rather as a grand theater where everyone played a predefined role, hiding their true intentions behind carefully constructed masks. Sociability, for most, is nothing more than a mask that hides their banality, he said. To him, society was nothing more than a stage where appearances reigned over authenticity. This view was directly tied to his major work, The World as Will and Representation, where he argued that everything we perceive is merely a projection of our minds. In his eyes, social life wasn't real. It was a distraction, a spectacle that kept people from true knowledge. And here's the problem. Most people are trapped in trivial concerns. Status, gossip, petty disputes for recognition. All of this, to Schopenhauer, was proof that the average human is a slave to the will, a blind, irrational impulse that drags us endlessly in an unrelenting search for validation. But while most people drowned in this superficial routine, those with a sharper intellect saw everything with brutal and almost cruel clarity. To them, society was nothing more than a hollow game where relationships rarely went beyond the surface. This disdain for social life wasn't exclusive to Schopenhauer. Other great thinkers felt the same disillusionment. Nietzsche, for instance, claimed that everything done for the love of the crowd is done poorly. And Pascal went even further, saying, all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. Nietzsche, for example, stated that convictions are more dangerous enemies of truth than lies, highlighting how people prefer to cling to illusions rather than face reality with honesty. This conflict between the pursuit of knowledge and the demands of social life created an unbridgeable chasm between the brightest minds and the rest of humanity. The result was inevitable: intellectual isolation. But this isolation did not come without consequences. Prolonged solitude could lead to disillusionment, apathy, and even contempt for the outside world. Schopenhauer was aware of this risk and warned that, for those who could see beyond the social illusion, The only alternative was to accept this reality and learn to live with it. But how does this isolation manifest in daily life? Why do those who are intellectually superior often feel frustrated with social interactions? In the next section, we will explore the clash between genius and mediocrity, and how this inevitably drives great thinkers away from ordinary life. Schopenhauer did not hold back in expressing his views on humanity. To him, most people were guided by superficial and selfish interests, with no inclination toward contemplation or deep thought. This created an inevitable abyss between those endowed with exceptional intelligence and the masses, whom he saw as distracted by trivialities and futility. Mediocrity generally only recognizes itself. Genius, on the other hand, sees mediocrity, but finds itself alone. This intellectual isolation arises because the thinker, by nature, seeks to understand the world in depth, while the majority are preoccupied with banalities like status, gossip, or fleeting entertainment. While the genius strives to unravel the mysteries of existence, they often encounter indifference or incomprehension when attempting to share their ideas. This explains why so many great thinkers felt frustrated with society. Schopenhauer himself despised mingling with ordinary people, as he believed that the mediocrity of the majority stifled the genius of the few. This thought echoes Voltaire's famous statement, "The secret to being boring is to tell everything you know." The problem is not just the difficulty of communication, but the difference in interests. While the genius seeks universal truths, the majority seeks only pleasure and distraction. This conflict is inevitable. For Schopenhauer, this intellectual imbalance made social interaction a burden for those with an elevated mind. We can see this dynamic reflected in countless historical figures. Nikola Tesla avoided social events and trivial interactions, viewing them as a waste of time. Isaac Newton was known for his reclusiveness and impatience with mundane conversations. Even Albert Einstein, one of the most celebrated scientists in history, admitted that he preferred solitude over the company of those who did not share his interest in profound ideas. But this distancing from the world is not always by choice. Often, it is society itself that rejects the genius. Innovative and unconventional thinking tends to provoke discomfort and resistance. Nietzsche called this the resentment of mediocrity, the tendency of ordinary people to despise and attack what they do not understand or what makes them feel inferior. Thus, the genius does not only withdraw by their own will, they are also pushed away by the hostility of the world around them. This forced solitude can lead to feelings of alienation and even contempt for social life. And here arises a fundamental question. If the world is a hostile place for great thinkers, how should they face this reality? Schopenhauer believed there was a solution, and it did not involve trying to fit into society, but rather accepting and cultivating solitude as a refuge for thought and contemplation. Is solitude a destiny or a choice? For Schopenhauer, it was both. He saw isolation as an inevitable result of superior intelligence, but also as an opportunity for intellectual and spiritual growth. The common man cannot endure solitude because he only feels comfortable in the company of others. The elevated man seeks solitude because in it, he finds himself. This vision leads us to an essential point. Solitude is not a punishment but a privilege. It offers the thinker the opportunity to immerse themselves in their own ideas without distractions, without the need to conform to the empty social conventions that dominate everyday life. It is in that silent space where creativity flourishes and understanding deepens. Many of history's greatest thinkers, scientists, and artists made solitude their inseparable companion. Emily Dickinson spent most of her life isolated in her home, dedicating herself exclusively to writing. Kant was known for his meticulous routine and indifference towards social events. Beethoven, in his increasing deafness, found in isolation the strength to create some of the most powerful symphonies in history. Solitude not only allows for greater depth in thought, but also preserves the authenticity of genius. Schopenhauer believed that by engaging too much with society, the brilliant mind risks getting lost in distractions and compromising its clarity of vision. This perspective strongly resonates with the Buddhist concept of detachment. Buddhism, one of Schopenhauer's major philosophical influences, teaches that attachment to the external world and social interactions often leads to suffering. True growth occurs in introspection and in distancing oneself from the illusions of the material world. However, a dilemma arises here. Human beings are, by nature, social animals. The search for belonging is part of our biology, and prolonged solitude can lead to distress and melancholy. Even the greatest thinkers, despite valuing isolation, suffered from the lack of meaningful connections. Nietzsche, for instance, who also saw solitude as a path to greatness, admitted that it could be painful. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he describes the philosopher as a hermit who descends from the mountain to share his wisdom, only to be met with rejection and misunderstanding. This dilemma is real. Distancing oneself from society brings freedom, but it also carries an existential burden that is difficult to bear. Schopenhauer, however, had a solution for this problem. He believed that although the genius could never fully fit into society, there was a way to interact with the world without being affected by its mediocrity: the adoption of philosophical detachment. A kind of emotional neutrality that allowed one to coexist with others without becoming too involved. And this strategy leads us to the final point. How can one navigate the world without being consumed by its superficiality? If having a brilliant mind means ending up alone, how did the great thinkers manage to live in society without feeling suffocated by so much triviality? Schopenhauer had an answer for this: the strategy of detachment, or rather, good old philosophical disengagement. Happiness belongs to those who are self-sufficient. For him, the key was not in seeking society's acceptance, but in building an inner fortress that allowed the individual to be the master of their own existence. The secret was not in trying to fit in or striving to change others, but in developing an attitude of serene detachment, like an observer analyzing reality without being affected by it. Schopenhauer suggested that instead of fighting against the world's mediocrity, the thinker should learn to face it with the same attitude a scientist adopts when observing an experiment: with curiosity, but without emotional involvement. This means accepting the banality of social life without becoming irritated by it, understanding the intellectual limitations of the majority without frustration, and maintaining one's mental independence without feeling the need for external validation. This strategy is similar to the approach of the Stoics, who advocated for emotional control in the face of adversity. Marcus Aurelius, one of Stoicism's greatest exponents, wrote in his Meditations, "Give yourself a gift, the gift of indifference to what is beyond your control. The world will always be filled with futile distractions and empty conversations, but it is up to the individual to decide how much of it is worth their attention." The thinker should not isolate themselves completely from society, but rather interact with it strategically, absorbing only what is useful and discarding the irrelevant. Despite having little patience for society, Schopenhauer did not believe total isolation was the solution. He knew that even great thinkers needed some level of human contact, whether to exchange ideas or to avoid sinking into absolute solitude. The secret, according to him, was choosing wisely whom to connect with and keeping interactions to a minimum, just enough to live in the world without losing one's sanity. This philosophy remains applicable today. In a world filled with digital distractions, fake news, and superficial relationships, knowing how to filter information and interactions is essential. Intelligence is not just about understanding the world, it is about knowing how to navigate it without losing oneself. Schopenhauer teaches us that, instead of lamenting the lack of connection with most people, we should see it as a sign of our intellectual freedom. After all, solitude can be a burden, but also a privilege, an opportunity to explore our own thoughts without external interference. And now, the question arises: would you rather adapt to the world, or accept it as it is and preserve your intellectual freedom? If you've made it this far, you've probably already realized that the relationship between intelligence and isolation is not just a quirk of fate, but a natural consequence of deep thinking. Schopenhauer showed us that great minds often find more comfort in solitude than in the company of the crowd. Not out of arrogance, but because the superficiality of social interactions can be exhausting for those who see beyond appearances. The smarter a person is, the more prone they are to solitude. But does this mean that being alone is the only path? Not necessarily. The The secret lies in understanding that solitude doesn't have to be seen as a punishment, but as a refuge. Being alone doesn't mean being abandoned. It means having time to think, reflect, and grow without the distractions and pressures of society. And perhaps that is the true test of intelligence. Knowing how to balance between the world and introspection, choosing when to connect and when to step away. Schopenhauer gives us the key to this freedom, but it's up to each of us to decide how to use it. If you've made it this far, I'm sure you've felt that strange mix of freedom and isolation that Schopenhauer described at some point. Intelligence can be a refuge, but also a prison. Don't you think? But you know what? There's something deeply liberating in accepting that not every silence needs to be filled. Not every connection is worth the effort. You're not alone in this journey. It may feel lonely, but in the end, as old Arthur once said, solitude is not the problem. The problem is the wrong company. I remember once, after hours lost in a book, I found myself staring at the wall, reflecting on some grand idea, until someone interrupted my philosophical moment to ask if I had seen the latest soap opera or heard the gossip of the day. It was at that moment that I realized, wanting deeper conversations isn't arrogance. It's a necessity. If this has ever happened to you, you know how frustrating it is to feel like you're speaking a different language. Like your mind is sailing in an ocean, while others insist on splashing in a puddle. But you know what? There's an upside to this. You don't have to get lost in the noise. You have the privilege of choosing your solitude. And now, let's be serious. If you like this video, you know what to do. Hit the like button, leave a comment below, and subscribe to the channel. Or, if you prefer, you can ignore all of this and go back to that fascinating conversation about the weather and the latest TikTok trend. But let's be honest. If you made it this far, you already know you deserve more stimulating debates, right? And if this video made you think, wait until you see what I have prepared for you next. 2 videos that will leave you even more restless. In the best way, of course. But consider this your warning. After watching them, you may never see the world the same way again. Click at your own risk.